Well, I'll tell you what's happening. In the big square building, things are getting sort of interesting. It's about numbers. So are you going to just roll with it? You're going to roll with all of the increases in expenses, all of the increased spending? Or are you going to roll in the other direction and say it's time to be fiscally responsible? Now, here's the interesting thing about this. It is sometimes, you shrug your shoulders and you say, I can't do anything about it. It's all predetermined. That's not really true. There are any number of bills that are now in what's called the crossover stage, which we're going to talk about right now, in which the Senate and the House have exchanged pleasantries and bills. And so right now, the House of Representatives is looking at the Senate bills and vice versa. And joining us to help parse some of that out, particularly with regards to a lot of bills that are tied like with an umbilical cord to your wallet, is Representative Aaron Johanson, representing the minority party as the minority party leader this morning, in-house as he is every Monday morning, bright and early during the session. Good morning.
Good morning, Mike.
That's a nice red power tie, man. I like these power ties.
I got to start out the right way on Mondays, you know?
Yeah. Now, celebrating the Green, did you have a good sort of a little break over the weekend, I hope?
I did.
I just happened to mention earlier that there's an awful lot of government that is sensational stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm not so sure that a lot of the sensational stuff is sort of boiled up to the top right now. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people don't see what the real important part of the session is, and that is, where are we going to get funding to do the things that we need to do, and when are we going to stop doing things that we don't? Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that. I mean, is the budget the number one issue right now?
Yeah, it's definitely what's been dominating the legislative session. We just passed it out last week from the House to the Senate, and so now they're considering it. And what we tried to do actually, I think it's actually, if you're a fiscal conservative out there, this is a budget that you can largely be proud of, especially in comparison to normally what is passed out of the House. But basically, to sum it up, the governor came in with requests that were pretty high that would have taken up all of basically the revenue we expected to gain. And so out of an abundance of caution, what the House Finance Committee did and what the House did in shaping the budget was actually pare it down by quite a bit by shaving off about $600 million over the next two fiscal years.
And for a place like Hawaii, shaving $600 million is a lot of money. Mm-hmm. That's $600 each.
It is, and kudos to the Finance Committee for taking a more proactive stance on things like positions that are funded but have been vacant for over a year or so. Some of them are important, but I think what you see is a more assertive tone by the Finance Committee to show some oversight of, okay, if you're a department and you've got a position that's been funded for over a year, but it's been vacant for over a year, why is that so? And come back and justify some more. So actually what the House Finance Committee did was it took out all the money from most of those vacant positions that had been vacant for over a year or so, because our chair,
let's live with it.
Our chair wanted to see some greater justification, just so that we know why we're spending what we're spending, as opposed to just continuing to spend.
I think there's a lot of confusion, and maybe you can shed some light on the subject for us. If we back up a step, and that is, what is the budget? Who rolls the budget together? Mm-hmm. What's it all about? And more importantly, and I think this is a real big issue, particularly right now, is there necessarily an adversarial relationship set up between the administration and the legislature? Because let's talk about who draws the budget out and who do they send it to look at it and approve it? How does the whole thing work?
Yeah, excellent question, because for one of the most important seminal documents that governs our state, so little is known about it. But the budget starts out constitutionally from the governor's office. They propose it to us in December by mandated date of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. We then consider it. It starts out in the House. The House makes changes to it. And it takes quite a while because, you're constantly having to look at what the Council of Revenues is forecasting along the way. In fact, they just had a new forecast actually right as we passed out the budget. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, sometimes the framers of the Constitution didn't take different meeting dates into mind. However, what's nice is they forecasted upward. But even if they forecasted upward, the key thing is it's just a forecast. It's not actual revenue, which is why it's better to have the House draft that we passed out of the budget to be a more conservative document and to say, we're not sure how things are going to go in the future, both from a macroeconomic perspective as well as taking into account some of our unfunded liabilities. So the House will make changes. The House then passes it out, usually early in March, and then the Senate will consider it. The Senate will make changes, and then what happens is before we rush to the mad dash of sine die, the House and the Senate will confer and get together a conference draft, and that's the final draft that gets passed out.
Yeah, it seems to be such a cumbersome, multifaceted, multi-pronged experience. But the interesting thing to me is, as a country, we haven't had a budget for several years. And as a state, we must have one.
Yeah, we
isn't
don't have
that
the luxury of continuing resolutions
yeah,
here.
we can't just say,
Lucky for the state of Hawaii, we don't.
Yeah,
I'm glad
now,
we don't.
I'm not sure of how many states have a mandated budget, but I know it's a majority. Most of our states have a majority. Now,
yeah, because most of our states can't print money. So,
Yeah,
there are mechanisms at the federal level that can offset what would normally be unthinkable to most people.
okay, now explain maybe what the dangers are. Let's say that if you go through overly optimistic on consular revenues or anything else, and you have a budget that reflects income that for some reason doesn't show up, now doesn't it even become more difficult to chop? Because where do you start? I mean, when there's going to be a shortfall, isn't it almost like a sequester?
Yeah.
Like everybody's got to start.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think, it's prudent to be like the squirrel that's saving away for winter, because winter is going to come. I mean, you and I know that from watching macroeconomic cycles, and especially particularly because Hawaii is very vulnerable to what happens both nationally as well as internationally with our economy tied to tourism. But if you don't leave some room, some wiggle room for the future, what ends up happening are what you saw once we hit that major recession in 2008, where you're having to cut billions, and it was very painful. I think Governor Lingle did a great job of trying to pare down the budget without increasing taxes, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't painful for the executive branch as well as everybody who was a recipient of those services. And so, if you don't leave that kind of room, then you have what end up seeming to most people draconian cuts.
I can tell you that from what I've gathered so far, the resort industry likes what's going on, because they can tell you that every time you say tourism is back, where everything's happy days are here again, that we get this false sense of security that can be offset by one incident.
Right.
By a Benghazi, or by a ptomaine poisoning on an airplane, by whatever.
Right.
And all of a sudden people just say, hey, let's not go right now. Let's wait.
Yep. Yeah,
And,
that's true.
And look at how many people that can affect, especially here in Hawaii. All right. That being said, do we have time? And we're going to, after this first break, start discussing some of these specific bills that are still alive that maybe are going to be spending too much of our money. Okay, we got more to come. Representative Aaron Johanson is in the House. If you'd like to join the conversation, you can only do so telephonically. We don't take any email questions or off-the-air comments while our political folks are in the studio. But if you'd like to chat with Aaron Johanson, he'd be glad to chat with you. The number's 296-KHNR. That's 296-5467.
KHNR.
You got to love it. What's around the bend? Well, I'll tell you something. It's a budget. And the way we're talking about the budget today allows you to have a little input into the conversation. Our Rep. Aaron Johanson is with us. As you know, the House is reviewing the Senate bills. And if you just joined us in the last segment, Aaron and I were talking about how the budget gets construed and how it gets debated and then how it gets presented. So just to make sure that we carry on, Aaron, so that people know how important it is for them to get involved in the process, that in another short period of time, you all will have had a look at the Senate proposals, and the Senate would have had a look at the House proposal.
Correct.
And then there's going to be agreement on a budget that will then get submitted to the governor.
Correct.
And then what happens?
And then that's the document that's in place.
So
governing
the governor can sign the budget, or he can veto it, or he can let it become the budget without a signature.
Correct.
Okay, so you mentioned that the House is looking at some cutbacks on some of the things that the governor had wished.
Yes.
And that you were seeing fiscal responsibility by both parties this year.
Yeah. I mean, I
Wow.
really
what a
do.
concept.
And the reason I mentioned that is because some of my majority colleagues have taken quite a hit for the essentially taking away funds from people who felt like they wanted it or deserved it. And so because there was that level of fiscal responsibility, I think there needs to be some commendation there. We talked about and this is the first time that the House Finance Committee has ever done this, of basically taking away the funds for vacant positions that have been vacant for a long time.
Yeah, which
requiring
by
justification.
the way, the public sector has been living through that experience for several years now.
Yeah, so there is a restoration of those labor savings costs. So
I meant private sector.
Yeah. So in that sense, I think there was a recognition of trying to compensate people for what they've gone through for the past few years, but also some of the things that have happened. Where I have seen personally in crafting the budget, if there were things that just didn't add up, didn't add up to the average taxpayer, lots of those things got excised out. Whether it was conforming salaries to what they would be in the private sector. Sometimes different departments and different agencies had very high asks for salaries. There was, a look at salary parity, a look at, if there were large-scale consulting services or things like that that just didn't necessarily have the people or the infrastructure to actually effectively utilize, scaling those back. So there, $600 million is quite a bit over 2 fiscal cycles, but we think that's necessary because we're not sure. Again, even though the forecasts are rosy by the Council on Revenues, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what our actual tax base is going to be.
Yeah, I love that. Don't count the chickens before they hatch out.
That's exactly what it is.
Now, I do know, however, Aaron, that there are some specific bills that are really not a good idea. And there's some maybe that are not being looked at favorably that are a good idea. Maybe you can give us some highlights on what the Minority Caucus thinks of some of the things that are still alive that may be spending a little bit more money than they should.
Sure. I think there are quite a few bills of concern, and what we're now seeing is sort of the first pass at the Senate bills that have crossed over, so we're starting to hear them in our initial committees. You still hear a lot of debate about minimum wage increases. The House position is, I think, a little more conservative than the Senate position on minimum wage increases. There's still quite a few taxes that have come over from the Senate. We passed over a few ourselves, but I would maintain that many of the ones that were most egregious died in the House, and hopefully they may experience the same fate if the Senate passed those over.
In the cutback mood that we seem to be in, that we by necessity, there also is always what some would say creative ways to make up the revenue that we're not getting, or to include a program. Are there some that are like that? In other words, a tax is a tax no matter how you disguise it. If you think it's a fee, if you think it's a that. What are some of the things that are still alive? For instance, the plastic bag bill for the moment is not.
Correct.
The increase in per gallon tax
on the gas
on the gas is pretty much
it's alive in a House bill that
it's stumbling. But what else? What else is out there that might be thinly veiled as a fee, but is actually just another tax?
Well, this one isn't so thinly veiled, but people would say, well, it doesn't apply to most people, so let's just go ahead and pass it. But the Senate passed over a conveyance tax increase on, I think I'm not sure if their threshold is $2 million as it was in the House, but a conveyance tax increase on real estate transactions for watershed protection. That was something that didn't pass the House, but it did pass the Senate. So, thankfully, they didn't pass the sugary beverage tax. So a lot
boy, that looked like it was coming for a while. Didn't it?
It did, and the governor's office still keeps advocating it. But I think, there's sometimes it remains to be seen until we get down to the final hour when somebody sticks something in.
You know what I'm worried about, and even though I don't take questions off the air, I did get a few comments over the weekend from people that knew that we had these sessions on Monday, and that said, please ask Rep. Johanson what he thinks about the importance of retaining as many state lands as we can, rather than looking at the easy way out. Oh, we can get money by selling off our land or by leasing out our land.
No, that's a great point. And actually, on the House front, there were several bills that I think greater protect our land from just sort of a short-term fix and a short-term infusion of cash. There was actually a bill that many of our caucus members signed to require a 2/3 vote of the legislature in order to actually sell parcels of land. So thereby ensuring that it's not just simple majority, it's something that has broad resonance, and there's been some thought to it. I think the reason that it's important to continue to still entertain those notions is because there are still versions of the PLDC that are alive. Now, they're scaled back, and it's called something different. I think the Senate passed the Public-Private Partnership Authority over onto us, and it's a pilot program just in a few specific areas. But ostensibly, that has potentially a detrimental impact to just the very thing that some of your listeners
I
were
did
asking
see,
about.
however, that the Star Advertiser sort of endorses this, that they look at some sort of a body seeming to be necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And, sometimes it may be, and sometimes we do need oversight. Is there a happy medium here? I mean, the PLDC bill going away, if it just gets changed by someone else, is still a duck.
Right. And I think that's what the legislature is grappling, quite honestly, to try to find is that happy medium, because most people in the legislature do want to see positive economic development that has long-term value. But how we get there and how we make sure that it actually happens in a quality way that passes the muster with regulatory framework is a struggle for us. Right
Okay, you're invited to join us, and in the order in which they come in. And here's somebody that waits, I think, patiently every Monday to further things that he is involved in. And he's one of these people that gets very involved in a lot of our shows. Don in Kaneohe with a question for Rep. Johanson. Good morning, Don.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
Hi, Don.
What do you got this week?
Well, this week is concerned during the Lingo administration. The Weights and Measures Department for the state was cut back. I don't know if it's eliminated. That's concerned inspectors going out and checking the scales at the supermarket, the calibration at the pumps. Has that agency or department been restored, and are they doing inspections of those scales and calibrations at the pumps at the gas station?
Yeah, that's a great one, Don. Thanks for your call. You mentioned earlier some positions that have not been filled aligned that way. There is some concern that there are certain places, and I know it's the hungry bird. What's your experience with regards to that sort of a question?
With respect to the weights and measures, it's something that I'm familiar with, but I have to say it hasn't come up as much in the 2.5 years that I've been there. So I'm not sure if there's been some restoration to that department, but I think it's something that we will check on, and it's something in case Don calls next week.
Yeah, and we should, trust me, he will.
Yeah.
But that being said, let's take another look at a bigger picture.
Your broader question is a good one.
And that is, it's a great question. And I know that it's a matter of hungry birds. We need people, inspecting our restaurants. We need, and this some is county and some is state, but we can't just say, well, we got no people to inspect elevators, so we don't inspect them.
Right. And so what you see is sometimes there are tax and fee increases that have paid for more inspections for elevators and boilers. And that was something the industry asked for and something that they wanted to, because the backlog was so high that they said it's worth more to us to have active inspectors. So can you increase the fee so that we can, it's a special fund, so that's not the general fund. But there are things that we did add in this budget. Even though we scaled it back quite a bit, we added more agricultural inspectors.
I was going to say these at the airports and on farms and crops, because I mean, it affects everything.
Right.
It?
So this budget was really, I think, very strategic. It was both a mix of cutting the things that were nice to have versus need to have, but also looking at what is the need to have and then putting in there. And one of the things I think that we're very excited about from the minority perspective is this accomplished many of the things that we've long fought for. Some fiscal responsibility, not going just full bore and having some accountability, but also just being strategic about restructuring and reprioritizing spending just to improve and make government more effective.
One thing that I must tell you that I look for with an anticipation, and I know that is that every now and again, and it seems like this year more than before, is that a lot of our legislators on both sides of the political fence are saying, look, this is a Hawaii issue. It's not another issue. This is all about us. And I mean us, Democrat, Republican, Green, Libertarian, Agnostic, whatever. Okay, we got more coming up on the other side of our 7:30 break. Rep. Aaron Johanson is in the house, and we've got plenty of time to discuss bills that might be near and dear to you, as well as bring up some things that you may not know about, and more importantly, on exactly how to react when they come up for a hearing and how you can find out about it and participate rather than wait until you hear what's on it. So the time is 7:30. You're listening to KHNR, Hawaii's Intelligent Talk on this Monday morning. We'll be right back. It's kind of ironic that I get a piece of bumper music that says, I can't go for that. And that's the attitude that some people have in the big square building. Every time a bill comes up for your hearing or discussion, I can't go for that. It's no good. It doesn't suit me. However, we're having less of that. And we're having a lot of cooperation on some bills that make sense for us. But there still are a few that don't. So if you've got one that you'd like to discuss this morning, join us. Representative Aaron Johanson's in the House, and we talk as we do on Mondays during the session. And, by the way, a offhanded compliment, a direct compliment, Aaron, was to please thank you for making time to come and visit with us every Monday, because we know it's kind of early, and we know that you're going to certainly have, after you're done with us, a really full day ahead. So hopefully go to bed early enough on Sunday night.
I do. It's a great way to start the week, though,
That's
and I
great.
appreciate being here with you and your listeners.
Well, Aaron, I know that there are some really important things, and a silent majority is not what you get from our listeners. I mean, our listeners are going to tell you one way or the other what they like or don't like. But I know that you all are just like we, except that you're our elected officials, and so you have to have bills that you champion, and you have to have bills that you're really scared about. I mentioned just now, reintroducing the segment, that we're getting less I can't go for that and more discussion. So let's talk about some specific references about some of the things that are going well and some of the things that you're still a little nervous about.
Sure. I mean, I think we are incredibly pleased as the session goes. It's not perfect, but as the session goes, there have been far fewer tax and fee increases, at least passed out of the House. And I think because the House has not had that kind of appetite for it, we see less coming over from the Senate. It's also a byproduct of the fact that things are not going terribly economically. So people, the drumbeat is not as loud behind the tax and fee folks as it usually is. So that's a positive thing. I mean, I also think it's a huge thing, and I hope the Senate considers it. We'll see if WHAM picks it up. But broad-based income tax relief. I mean, the House passed out a bill for income tax relief across all brackets, from the lower income all the way to the upper middle income and small businesses.
Which, by the way, if something's going to increase or decrease, it's only fair that it should percentage-wise affect everybody about the same way.
Because it's one of the things that impacts our cost of living the most. So those are some of the positive things. There have been some increased transparency bills for government. We always think that that's great, and some greater accountability, at least stuck through the budget. Now, there are some things that people aren't going to like that are coming through. I see on the docket for this week that the Senate passed over to us, things like red light cameras.
Yeah, let's look at that. In other words, when we had the van cams of old, it was like, holy smokes, I can't believe this. And now it's coming back. There are still those that are in the hanger-on group that are looking at it as strictly a revenue grab. It seems to me, though, that this legislation is looking at administering a program by the counties or by the state rather than an independent contractor making money off our failures as drivers.
I think that's a major change in the bill, that it would not be administered by somebody who would profit off of the collection of revenue if you run through a red light. So, and the bill that is moving, I believe, that's going to be heard is just in a few specific areas. I think 2 in Eva Beach.
Yeah, like a trial
in
trial
Maui.
deal,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
So, it's paring back what was previously repealed long before I was in the legislature. But it still mixed emotions from people.
If people have a position on that one way or the other, what bill is that? What number can they go research?
I believe it's SB.
There's only 10 million that I'm putting them on the spot
SB
for.
693.
693. Okay. Now, what about this? My personal pet peeve right now, and as it is almost every session, is education. And I do know that we're having
a lot.
Yeah, we do have a big issue with the with it looks like the administration and the teachers union going to arbitration. Tremendous input in this session about the emphasis and a lot of support for early education. How do we differentiate between those bills that are education and those that are early education?
Sure. I think most of the bills, quite honestly, that are moving through, that get talked about all the time, are specifically related to early education. In fact, it's that's sort of dominated the Education Committee's agenda at this point, and there are several of them. One of them asks for a constitutional amendment to be able to expend public dollars for private, essentially preschool. That would be a constitutional amendment. That's SB 1084. There's also a school readiness program for those who are left out of the junior K program that we got rid of, which is SB 1093. And then lastly, a move to establish early childhood education system, sort of a universal preschool system in SB 1095. So those are the major ones. We didn't hear the House versions in finance, and so it's only those Senate vehicles that are moving right now.
Okay, now here's where some are concerned, and maybe you can shed some light on how this works. As we get nearer and nearer the completion of the session, sometimes a lot of these bills get massaged around, and it seems to me that all three of these could involve folding in parts of each other into one bill that becomes a super bill, which everybody has a hard time fighting against, which may not be what everybody is really wanting.
Right. I'm not sure why some of them are separate bills. I know that the constitutional amendment, that one probably will not end up having others folded into it because unless it would become an actual written part of the Constitution, it just wouldn't make sense. But I'm not sure why there wasn't one preschool omnibus bill. But then again, I've only been there for 2.5 years, so I'm probably not the most experienced
that being
drafter.
said, and somebody always asks about this, and even though I'm anticipating it's out there, there are a lot of people that don't understand what a constitutional amendment is, and on top of that, there's a lot of people that don't understand, for whatever the reason, we have not had a constitutional convention in Hawaii since 1978.
Right.
Now that was an awful long time ago.
Right. It was. It was.
So how can is there any other state in the union that where there's been such a disparaging length of time before we turn around and say, have things changed or we need to amend or take a look at our Constitution?
I'm not sure. And quite honestly, it's something I think about whenever I see these constitutional amendment proposals, which is just a fancy way of saying a change to the Constitution, and a change that requires the voters to approve before the Constitution can be amended. But if you have all these bills that seek constitutional changes, it does certainly beg the broader question of whether or not it's just better to have a constitutional convention. But I think I don't know that that's popular collective will at the moment.
Well, it certainly has not been every time it's come up for discussion.
Right.
Yeah, for many years.
Right.
But there would be some that say, look, that's because the current class of lawmakers doesn't want anybody to invade what they do. They want to keep doing what they're doing without it. Isn't it also true that a constitutional convention anywhere where it's been so long, it would be a very arduous, drawn-out, probably lengthy and expensive process, and maybe that's what's scaring some people.
Yeah, that's definitely some of the criticism that comes up whenever this idea comes up.
Okay, speaking about things that are coming up, I know that you get about 8 minutes for breakfast after you leave here to go to work. What's coming up now? What are some of the things that are popping up in the next day or two that people really need to take a look at or at least keep an ear to the ground for?
Yeah, we talked about some of them. The conveyance tax increase on real estate transfers for watershed protection, this public-private partnership authority with the limited test runs in different areas, some of the red light cameras. We're going to be seeing quite a few of, eventually, in the Finance Committee, we'll be seeing some of these early education bills that we talked about. And so what you're seeing, what's really interesting for most of your listeners is imagine, sort of the widest net as the beginning of session, and it's more and more narrowed now. So you're starting to see, just even because the House and the Senate pass bills over to each other doesn't necessarily mean we'll consider them. So right now, everybody's starting to look, we've got limited time. Let's just focus in on the ones where clearly there's broad resonance.
It doesn't mean that one group or the other can say, we like this, and they throw it to the other group, and they say, we're not even going to talk about it.
Right.
It's dead.
Right.
Here is one thing that I think is a major concern, and that is when you talk about the conveyance tax increase, you're talking about on real estate over a certain value, and you're talking about it going into a specific place. Haven't we learned from our experience that all these monies that have gone to specific places before have been taken out of those specific places later when needs come up? Are there any bills around that look like going after some special funds to take them away?
I'm not aware of any off the top of my head. I know in the past, typically you see more of those bills to take money away from special funds when it's a bad budgetary cycle and you need more money quickly. You just raid from those funds.
So we're looking at this not being a, quote, bad cycle because of expectations of things we're getting back to normalcy?
or getting a little better.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I don't think anybody thinks we're going to have robust economic growth, but certainly the economists are saying that we're going to grow and things are going to be a little bit better. But again, there still is that need to be cautiously optimistic and to have that reflected in the budget so that the taxpayers don't end up paying when things don't go just as the economists predict.
Okay, I've got a question for Rep. Johanson that I think that you will be out there interested to learn the answer to, and it's about why in the world is the state legislature looking at bus routes on the island of Oahu? What has that got to do? I thought the city and the state were separate. We'll talk about that when we come back. 15 to go on the Mike Buck Show featuring Representative Aaron Johanson, and you can join the conversation if you will. I'm getting a bunch of email. Remember, we don't take email during these times. We take only live calls and not even any off the air. And if you want to be a part of that live part, it's 296-KHNR or 296-5467. We'll be
KHNR.
Everybody's happy. Little Sweet Georgia Brown. You know, whenever you hear that music, it sort of makes you happy. And that's, I guess, why they picked that personal piece of music for the Harlem Globetrotters, making smiles across faces wherever they go. And it's sort of, I guess, if there were a pep talk or something, Happy Days Are Here Again and Sweet Georgia Brown, that'd be sort of a neat way to open up the ledge every day. I do know that one thing, and just as a funny aside, there was one time it was the Japanese Parliament, and it was what they go through prior to they actually get in fights right on the floor sometimes. There,
Yeah, that happens a lot in
yeah,
Asia.
I mean, and in other places too. But
We
this
think
is
it's bad in Washington.
yeah, this was actually calisthenics and warm-up exercises that these people do as a group before they do a battle with one another every day. Does it sometimes bother you that we call it a battle? Should it really not be called a battle?
Yeah, I mean, I think that doesn't. It sometimes honestly feels like that, but to be honest, if we treated it more like a dialogue and added mutual respect in there, it'd make it a lot easier to just be able to say, Mike, that's a good idea, but I disagree with you, and I'm not going to pass it, or I respect your opinion, but we disagree. And it's sometimes it's that loss of civility actually that makes it most difficult to actually get something good done for
Sure.
people.
I actually had an interesting experience the other day, and I was sort of waiting, and that's why prior to the break there I asked the question. I think it's very confusing to a lot of us, and I'm part of it, the us, the differentiation between the state and the city in a lot of things, like whose road is that, a state or city road? Whose park is that? Whose law is that? And whose tax is that? Or whose? And all of a sudden, there are people that were concerned about or confused about people from the legislature having a town hall meeting in the state capitol about city items like bus service. And I'm thinking, okay, I mean, our legislators are citizens and they live in and ride buses. Maybe, I don't know. But isn't that sort of a strange gathering? I mean, I don't get it. What does it hope to accomplish?
Well, I think on the most basic of level, it's legislators and council members just trying to get people involved, people participating in government, and people aware. And as a result, what you often see is sometimes the most interesting issues to people are county issues, unfortunately. I mean, I think state issues are very big, but not everybody wants to talk state policy. Not everybody's you, Mike.
Yeah,
So
well,
sometimes people just want to talk about the bus routes.
I think that people want to talk about two things: their hearts and their wallets. And that's why there's, I think, an ongoing state of confusion between what city and what state, because my listeners want to say, isn't it the whole thing?
Well, the bus routes are definitely a county function, but sometimes if legislators are part of a hui and doing something together, then they may have a county issue that dominates. I know I myself participate in the Aiea Pearl City Legislators Group, which includes two of our council members from that side of the island, and sometimes we have the county perspective. It hasn't been just a county issue, but when we talk about the state of transportation, we'll have the state DOT director as well as the city DTS director. So
well, it's always interesting when we have that discussion, say like Nimitz Highway, because we know that Nimitz Highway is a state road, and yet every street that intersects it here is a city.
Right.
So when there's a pothole, who fixes it? In other words, these are some of the things. Isn't it sort of true also that most of us don't differentiate between, gee, who do I call?
Correct.
What about the constant move that's always been said? Look, why is there so much duplication of effort between city and state? And why doesn't that come up for discussion? Why don't we amalgamate, say, the transportation or the road maintenance or the parks departments? Why are we still apart in some of those areas?
That's a good question. It's one that I think of in constantly trying to think about how to make government more effective. And one of the things that I found a most compelling and persuasive answer is they have different missions. So while we feel a pothole on a city road feels the same as a pothole on a state road.
To our cars, it certainly
yes,
does. Yeah,
it does.
yeah.
You might be going at different speeds on the state road. But what ends up happening is just sometimes it's a more effective use to have separate departments, to go out and fix the freeway because that's what you're equipped for, as opposed to just patch a pothole right on a street that's rarely traversed. And so, plus, this is a fascinating thing that I think you really only see sometimes in American government. Because we're focused on checks and balances, you find that on the municipal and state level. And sometimes is there a duplication of service? I think there is. But at the same time, you find the county folks and the state folks saying, this is our jurisdiction, this is our check on you,
Sure.
to make sure that we have some checks and balances.
I think the main complaints, particularly during tough times, were always, look, if we had one road crew and it was jointly funded, I mean, separated between the city and state, the city pays so much into that crew, the state so much into that crew, there was one whole group of people that could be eliminated. That put a fear out in a lot of people, particularly in a lot of unions. So I'm wondering how many of these jobs are union-protected jobs that could be either parsed out. For instance, and let's spend the last couple of minutes on our ongoing, I guess, debate on privatization. What should government privatize and what shouldn't it? For instance, right now, final question, the prison system. Where the governor is telling us that we're bringing everybody home, and everybody's trying to do that, and yet there was a reason why to send everybody away in the first place. Where do we go when it comes to stuff like that?
I think that's an ongoing dialogue that, quite honestly, nobody has completely the right answer to. When we sent them to some of these Corrections Corporation of America facilities, were there some issues and potential questions about accountability? Sure, there were. Does that mean that publicly administered prisons here are perfect either? No. I mean, I think there are always issues and things that always need to be refined, and that's what, quite honestly, is the dominating the dialogue right now, and what we're having to try to figure out. Because, you see it actually in the Hawaii Health Systems Corporation dialogue right now. There's talk about whether or not to privatize it and whether or not to bring in Banner Health Systems. But sometimes what we see is actually quote unquote privatizing something doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't some government nexus. For instance, these bills are not alive, at least in the House versions, privatizing the Hawaii Health Systems Corporation.
Right, that went out.
Yeah, it would have been brought in Banner Health, but Banner Health under the agreement still would have been subsidized by the state. So, one always has to, the devil's in the details, and I think we conveniently label things either publicly funded or privately funded, but sometimes they're a mixture of both, and that mixture necessitates, some critical thinking and analysis.
Okay, well, let's take a look at two areas in our final moments. One being the prison systems. I know the prison systems in late has come under some things that are embarrassing and some things that need to be looked at. Ted Sakai was quoted saying, look, we've got to stop what we're doing and evaluate, the prison guards. We've got prison guards whose requirement for education is a high school diploma or not. So the prisons are of major concerns, and so is whether or not that we have an easier path to people to get registered to be voting. Is there anything currently alive in either branch right now dealing with the Department of Corrections, or are they looking at fixing themselves?
I think most of that is happening at the administrative level. I don't remember seeing, certainly not out of what we passed out of the House, there are not a lot of public safety bills dealing with the correction system. Now, there might be some that passed over from the Senate, but I think more of what they're looking at in terms of reform is at the administrative executive.
Yeah, and
branch
that was
level.
one of the things that I meant earlier as an example of some of the things that are laid out to confuse people when we get down to the nitty gritty. And the other thing, of course, was the University of Hawaii came under real scrutiny this
Right,
year.
right.
And there will be apparently some changes there, at least in their procurement process, that is legislated.
That's a bill that we passed out to not only establish an auditing committee, but also to remove the UH president's procurement authority as the chief procurement officer and switch it to the state procurement officer, who would then have oversight and jurisdiction over their procurements.
And one would assume a great deal of communication, being responsive to the university's needs, and yet controlling the actual, I don't want to say budgeting process, but CIP or capital improvement budget process.
Yeah, the university has large capital improvements, and large procurements. So that's a significant change in responsibility.
Light at the end of the tunnel. If people want to get onto a bill, what's the best way they should do it? If people want to comment or learn more, what can they do?
Best way is to contact your legislator and ask them, or you can track the bill number yourself on capital.hawaii.gov. Again, that's capital TIOL. TOL at hawaii.gov.
Hey, Aaron Johanson, thanks for joining us. Good luck in the big square building today. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Mike.